The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle, as thousands of tourists began gathering for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd, Sarah Mitchell pushed her 10-year-old son Tommy's wheelchair carefully through the pressing mass of people. Tommy had been born with cerebral palsy, but his face always lit up whenever he saw soldiers in their bright red uniforms and tall black hats. "Mummy, are we really going to see the Queen's Guards today?" Tommy asked, his speech slightly slurred but filled with excitement. His eyes sparkled with the kind of pure joy that only children possess when their greatest dreams are about to come true. Sarah smiled down at her son, adjusting the small Union Jack flag he clutched tightly in his hands. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going to see them march, and maybe even get close enough for you to wave at them." She had saved for months to bring Tommy to London, working extra shifts at the local cafe just to afford this special trip. The crowd around them grew thicker as the ceremony time approached. People pushed forward, eager to get the best viewing spots, but this created a problem. Tommy's wheelchair was getting blocked by adults who towered over him. Despite Sarah's polite request for people to let them through, they found themselves stuck at the back of the crowd where Tommy could see nothing but legs and backs. "I can't see anything, Mummy," Tommy said, his voice starting to crack with disappointment. He had been talking about this trip for weeks, showing everyone pictures of the Queen's Guard from library books and practicing his salute in the mirror. Sarah felt her heart breaking. She had promised her son this experience, but she hadn't anticipated how difficult it would be to navigate through such crowds with a wheelchair. She tried lifting Tommy up, but his condition made it painful for him to be held for long periods. Other parents were hoisting their children onto their shoulders, but this wasn't an option for Tommy. "Excuse me, could my son please move forward? He's in a wheelchair and can't see," Sarah called out to the crowd. A few people turned around and smiled sympathetically, but the mass of tourists remained largely unmoved. Everyone wanted the perfect photo, the perfect view. Just as Sarah was beginning to think they might have to leave without Tommy seeing anything, she noticed something unusual. One of the Queen's Guards, standing perfectly still at his post about 30 feet away, seemed to be looking directly at them. His face remained expressionless under his bearskin hat, but his eyes appeared to be focused on Tommy's disappointed face. The guard's name was James Wellington. Though none of the tourists knew this, he had been serving as one of Her Majesty's Guard for 3 years, trained never to break character, never to respond to tourists no matter how they tried to get his attention. But something about the small boy in the wheelchair, clutching his little flag and unable to see through the crowd, stirred something deep inside him. James had a younger brother with Down syndrome back home in Yorkshire. He understood the challenges families like Tommy's faced every day. He watched as the boy's mother tried desperately to find a way for her son to see the ceremony he had obviously been so excited about. The other guards had noticed James's attention, drifting toward the crowd, which was unusual. Guard duty required complete focus and absolute stillness, but they too began to notice the situation unfolding. There was something about Tommy's innocent excitement and his mother's determination that touched them all. As the minutes ticked by toward the ceremony's start, James made a decision that would go against every rule in his training manual. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move from his position, but there were other ways to communicate. He began to formulate a plan that would require the help of his fellow guards and perfect timing. The crowd continued to grow, and Tommy's view became even more blocked. Sarah considered leaving, but she couldn't bear to disappoint her son, who had been looking forward to this moment for so long. She decided to wait just a few more minutes, hoping something might change. What neither Sarah nor Tommy realized was that their presence had not gone unnoticed by the very people they had come to see. The Queen's Guards, trained to observe everything while appearing to see nothing, were already putting a plan into motion that would create a memory Tommy would treasure for the rest of his life. Guard James Wellington stood motionless at his post, but his mind was racing. The traditional ceremony was about to begin, and protocol demanded that he remain perfectly still and silent. However, he couldn't stop thinking about Tommy, who was still trapped behind the crowd of adults, unable to see anything despite his obvious excitement. James caught the eye of his fellow guard, Michael Thompson, who was positioned about 20 feet to his left. Using barely perceptible eye movements and the slightest facial expressions that only another guard would recognize, James began to communicate. This was a skill they had all learned during training: how to alert each other to potential security threats without breaking character. But today, James was using it for something entirely different. Michael followed James's subtle gaze toward Tommy and his mother. He immediately understood the situation. Michael had nieces and nephews of his own, and the sight of the disappointed child struck a chord with him too. But what could they do? Breaking protocol during a public ceremony was a serious offense that could end their careers. The crowd grew more restless as the official ceremony time approached. Tourists raised their cameras and phones, creating an even thicker wall between Tommy and his dream of seeing the Queen's Guard up close. Sarah had lifted her son as high as she could manage, but Tommy's condition made it difficult for him to maintain any position for long. "My arms hurt, Mummy," Tommy whispered, trying not to complain but clearly struggling. "Can we go home now?" The defeat in his voice was heartbreaking. Sarah's eyes began to well up with tears as she realized that despite all her planning and saving, she might not be able to give her son this simple joy. She was about to suggest they leave when something extraordinary began to happen. James Wellington made a decision that would change everything. Still maintaining his rigid posture and expressionless face, he began to execute a series of movements that appeared to be part of his regular guard duties, but were actually carefully planned signals to his fellow guards. First, he performed an almost imperceptible adjustment to his rifle position. To the tourists, it looked like standard guard behavior, but Michael Thompson recognized it as the agreed-upon signal they had worked out years ago for "pay attention to my lead." Within seconds, the signal had been passed down the line to all 6 guards on duty. The lead guard, Sergeant David Walsh, a veteran with 15 years of service, noticed the unusual communication between his men. His first instinct was to maintain order and discipline, but when he saw what had captured their attention, his perspective shifted. Sergeant Walsh had served multiple tours overseas and had seen enough of life's harsh realities to appreciate moments of pure innocence like Tommy's. Excitement. Rather than shutting down what he knew was developing, Sergeant Walsh made his own command decision. Using the same subtle communication system, he sent a message down the line: "Proceed with care." The ceremony officially began with the arrival of the new guard. The crowd pressed forward even more, and Tommy disappeared completely from view, behind the wall of people. But the Queen's Guards had a plan that none of the tourists could have anticipated. As the formal ceremony progressed with its traditional music and marching, something unusual began to happen. The guards started to subtly adjust their positions in a way that appeared completely normal to most observers, but was actually creating a specific formation. James Wellington, while maintaining perfect military bearing, began to angle his body slightly toward where Tommy was sitting. The movement was so small that most people wouldn't notice, but it was the first step in what would become an extraordinary display of compassion. Michael Thompson followed suit, making his own tiny adjustment. Then the next guard, and the next. To anyone watching casually, it looked like standard military positioning. But they were actually creating a subtle funnel effect, drawing attention toward one specific area of the crowd. Sarah noticed something, was different but couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. The guard seemed more aware somehow. She had visited other ceremonial guard posts where the soldiers seemed like statues, completely disconnected from their surroundings. But these guards seemed to have a presence about them, as if they were truly seeing the people around them. Tommy, still unable to see over the crowd, began to hum quietly to himself. It was something he did when he was trying not to cry. The little tune was barely audible, but in the brief moments between the ceremonial music, a few people near him could hear it. It was "God Save the Queen," slightly off-key but sung with genuine feeling. One of the guards, positioned closest to the crowd, heard Tommy's quiet humming. The sound of this special needs child singing the national anthem with such pure devotion, despite not being able to see the ceremony he had come so far to witness, affected him deeply. The first phase of their unofficial plan was now in motion, but the real surprise was yet to come. The guards had broken the first rule. They had acknowledged the presence of individual members of the public. But they were about to break an even bigger rule, one that would risk their careers but create a moment of magic that none of them would ever forget. The formal ceremony continued with its precise military choreography, but beneath the surface something unprecedented was taking shape. Sergeant Walsh had been watching the developing situation carefully, and he made a decision that would go down in the unofficial history of the Queen's Guard. During a brief pause in the ceremony, while the band prepared for the next musical piece, Sergeant Walsh did something that shocked even his own men. He broke formation, not obviously, but in a way that created a small gap in the line of guards. To most observers, it looked like a routine adjustment, but his men understood immediately that this was their cue. James Wellington seized the moment. While maintaining his military bearing and keeping his face expressionless, he took 3 measured steps to his right. The movement appeared to be part of the ceremony to anyone watching, but it positioned him directly in Tommy's line of sight, even through the crowd. For the first time since arriving at the castle, Tommy could see one of the Queen's Guards clearly. His face lit up with pure joy, and he raised his small Union Jack flag as high as his condition would allow. "Mummy, I can see him. I can see the guard," he whispered excitedly, trying to contain his enthusiasm. But James Wellington wasn't finished. In what would later be described by witnesses as the most touching moment they had ever seen at a royal ceremony, he did something that no Queen's Guard is supposed to do. He acknowledged Tommy's presence. It started with the slightest movement of his eyes. James looked directly at Tommy and held his gaze for just a moment. To everyone else, it might have looked like he was simply scanning the crowd, but Tommy knew the guard was looking at him specifically. The connection was immediate and magical. Then, in a movement so subtle that many people missed it entirely, James gave Tommy the smallest possible nod. It was barely perceptible, lasting less than a second, but it was deliberate and unmistakable. He had just broken one of the most sacred rules of being a Queen's Guard, and he had done it for a 10-year-old boy with cerebral palsy. Tommy's reaction was instant and overwhelming. His eyes filled with tears of joy and his whole body seemed to vibrate with excitement. "Mummy, he looked at me. The Queen's Guard looked at me." He waved his flag more vigorously, his speech becoming more animated despite its usual difficulties. Sarah watched in amazement as she saw her son experience a moment of pure magic. She had brought him to London hoping he might catch a glimpse of the famous guards, but this was far beyond anything she had dared to dream. The guard had not only seen Tommy, but had acknowledged him as a person worthy of attention. But the guards weren't finished with their surprise. Michael Thompson, positioned near James, had been watching the interaction closely. When he saw the joy on Tommy's face, he was inspired to contribute to the moment. During the next musical interlude, he too made a small adjustment to his position, bringing himself into Tommy's view. The crowd began to notice that something unusual was happening. Other parents with children started to point out that the guards seemed to be paying special attention to someone in the crowd. Some people began to turn around to see what had captured the guards' interest. When they saw Tommy in his wheelchair, clutching his flag and beaming with joy at the guards who were acknowledging him, something beautiful happened among the spectators. Without any announcement or organization, people began to step aside, creating a clear path between Tommy and the guards. "Come on through, love," said an elderly woman, gently guiding Tommy's wheelchair forward. "Let the little lad get a proper view." Others joined in, with parents lifting their own children aside to make room for Tommy to move closer to the ceremony. As Tommy was wheeled forward through the newly created pathway, more of the guards caught sight of him. One by one, in movements so subtle they could have been coincidental but clearly weren't, each guard found a way to acknowledge Tommy's presence. A slight turn of the head here, a brief moment of eye contact there, each gesture carefully timed to avoid breaking the overall dignity of the ceremony. Tommy was now in the front row, close enough to see every detail of the guards' magnificent uniforms. He could see their polished boots, their gleaming buttons, and most importantly, their faces under the famous bearskin hats. But more than that, he could see that they were seeing him back. The other children in the crowd began to notice. Tommy's special treatment, but instead of jealousy, there was something else in their faces. Understanding. Even young children seemed to recognize that something special was happening, that this boy needed this moment more than they did. Sarah stood behind her son's wheelchair, with tears streaming down her face. In all her years of dealing with Tommy's condition, fighting for his inclusion in schools and activities, advocating for his needs, she had rarely seen him treated with such dignity and respect by strangers. These elite soldiers, trained to ignore the public completely, had gone out of their way to make her son feel special and valued. The ceremony continued, but now it had taken on a different character entirely. What had started as a routine tourist attraction had become something much more meaningful, a display of human compassion that transcended rules and protocols. The guards maintained their professional demeanor, but there was warmth in their bearing that hadn't been there before. As the band struck up the next piece, Tommy began to hum along again, but this time he wasn't trying to hide his disappointment. He was humming with pure joy, sharing in a moment that he would remember for the rest of his life. The guards could hear his voice, sweet and slightly off-key, joining in with their ceremonial music, and it made their rigid formations feel somehow more meaningful. As the ceremony reached its climax, something even more extraordinary was about to unfold. Tommy had been watching the guards with complete fascination, his small Union Jack flag still clutched tightly in his hands. What happened next would transform this already special moment into something that would be talked about for years to come. During a traditional pause in the ceremony, when the guards typically stand at perfect attention for several minutes, James Wellington noticed that Tommy was struggling. The excitement and effort of holding up his flag had tired his arms, and his cerebral palsy made it difficult for him to maintain the position. The little flag was starting to droop, and Tommy's face showed the frustration of wanting to keep waving but being physically unable to do so. Without hesitation, James made a decision that would have shocked his commanding officers if they had known what he was thinking. He began to execute what appeared to be a standard ceremonial movement, but was actually something completely unprecedented. Moving with the same precision and dignity that characterized all guard movements, James took several steps forward toward the rope barrier that separated the guards from the public. To most observers, it looked like part of the ceremony, but James was positioning himself directly in front of Tommy, close enough that they were only a few feet apart. Once in position, James did something that no Queen's Guard had ever done during a public ceremony. While maintaining his perfectly straight posture and keeping his face expressionless, he slowly and deliberately moved his rifle from its standard position and brought it to a ceremonial salute position. But this wasn't a salute to a superior officer or a member of the royal family. This was a salute specifically for Tommy. The crowd fell completely silent. Even the band seemed to pause as people realized what they were witnessing. This elite guard, trained to show respect only to the highest-ranking officials and royalty, was saluting a 10-year-old boy with special needs. Tommy's reaction was immediate and powerful. His eyes grew wide with wonder, and despite his tired arms, he managed to raise his flag high above his head. With great effort and determination, he attempted his own salute, trying to copy the guard's movements as best as his condition would allow. "He's saluting me, Mummy," Tommy whispered in amazement. "The Queen's Guard is saluting me." His voice was filled with such pure joy and disbelief that several people in the crowd began to cry. But James wasn't alone in his gesture. Michael Thompson, seeing what his fellow guard had done, stepped forward and took his own position. Within moments, he too brought his rifle to salute position, joining James in honoring Tommy. The sight of two of Her Majesty's guards saluting this special little boy was overwhelming. One by one, the other guards followed suit. Sergeant Walsh, realizing that his men had crossed a line from which there was no return, made his own command decision. If they were going to break protocol, they might as well do it properly. He stepped forward and joined his men, bringing all 6 guards into a formal salute formation facing Tommy. The crowd was now completely captivated by what they were witnessing. Cameras and phones were recording from every angle, but people seemed to understand that they were seeing something that transcended mere spectacle. This was a moment of pure human connection and respect. Tommy, overwhelmed by the attention but determined to respond appropriately, struggled to maintain his salute. His mother Sarah stepped forward to support his arm, helping him hold the position with dignity. Together, mother and son returned the salute of the Queen's Guard, creating an image that would later be shared around the world. The salute lasted for a full 30 seconds, an eternity in ceremonial terms. During those moments, there was complete silence except for the sound of Tommy's slightly labored breathing as he concentrated on maintaining his salute. His face showed intense focus and pride as he tried to match the guards' perfect military bearing. When the guards finally lowered their rifles, Tommy lowered his flag with equal solemnity. But before returning to their original positions, each guard took a moment to make direct eye contact with Tommy and give him a small nod of acknowledgement. These were trained soldiers who had served around the world, but they were also human beings who recognized courage and joy when they saw it. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. It started with a few people clapping and quickly spread throughout the entire gathering. Tourists from dozens of different countries speaking many different languages all joined together in showing their appreciation for what they had just witnessed. But the applause wasn't just for the guards' unexpected gesture. People were also applauding Tommy, recognizing the courage it had taken for him to return the salute despite his physical challenges. He had risen to the occasion and conducted himself with the dignity of a true gentleman. Sarah was crying openly now, not from sadness but from overwhelming gratitude and pride. Her son, who often faced stares and whispers in public, had just been honored by some of the most respected soldiers in the world. They had seen past his disability and recognized his worth as a person. As the formal ceremony resumed, the guards returned to their positions with the same precision they had shown throughout. But something had changed. The rigid formality had been replaced by something warmer and more human. They continued to perform their duties with complete professionalism, but there was now a connection between them and the crowd that hadn't existed before. Tommy watched the rest of the ceremony with rapt attention, but he kept looking back at the guards who had saluted him. Each time he caught one of their eyes, he would give a small wave or smile, and despite their training, they would acknowledge him with the slightest movement or expression. The other children in the crowd had been inspired by what they witnessed. They began to stand a little straighter and wave their own flags with more pride and respect. Tommy had shown them what it meant to conduct oneself with dignity in the presence of such an honor, and they were following his example. As the official ceremony began to wind down, the guards prepared for their final formation march. Traditionally, this would be when they would march away in perfect synchronization, leaving the tourists to disperse and the castle grounds to return to normal activity. But today would be different from any other day in the history of the Queen's Guard ceremonies. Sergeant Walsh approached the final phase of the ceremony with a mixture of professional duty and personal conviction. He knew that what his men had done was unprecedented, and that there would likely be consequences to face later. But as he looked at Tommy's face, still glowing with joy and wonder, he felt certain they had made the right choice. The band struck up the traditional closing march, and the guards began their final formation. But as they prepared to march past the crowd for the last time, James Wellington caught Tommy's eye once more. The little boy had been watching every movement with intense concentration, trying to memorize every detail of this magical experience. What happened next would become legendary among those who witnessed it. As the guards began their march past the crowd, they did something that broke every rule in their manual but honored something far more important than regulations. Each guard, as he passed directly in front of Tommy, made a subtle but unmistakable gesture of acknowledgement. James Wellington was the first. As he marched past, he executed what appeared to be a standard eyes right movement, but he held his gaze on Tommy for just a moment longer than regulation required. His expression remained solemn and professional, but there was warmth in his eyes that Tommy immediately recognized. Michael Thompson followed, performing his own version of the acknowledgement. As he passed Tommy's position, he adjusted his pace, ever so slightly, giving the boy a few extra seconds to see him clearly. The movement was so subtle that only someone watching very carefully would notice. But Tommy noticed everything. One by one, each guard repeated this gesture as they marched past. To most observers, it looked like flawless military precision. But Tommy and his mother knew they were receiving a personal farewell from each of these remarkable men who had made their day so special. The crowd, which had been chattering and moving around throughout most of the ceremony, now stood in respectful silence as they watched this final tribute. Even people who hadn't fully understood what had happened earlier could sense that something extraordinary was taking place. As the last guard passed by Tommy's position, something unexpected happened. Tommy, with great effort and determination, struggled to stand up from his wheelchair. His condition made standing difficult and painful, but he was determined to show his respect for these men who had honored him so greatly. Sarah quickly moved to support her son, understanding his intention. "Are you sure, sweetheart?" she whispered. "You don't have to stand." "I want to, Mummy," Tommy replied with fierce determination. "They stood for me. I want to stand for them." With his mother's help, Tommy rose to his feet, his legs shaky but his resolve strong. As he stood there, holding his Union Jack flag high above his head, he began to sing. His voice was quiet and slightly unclear due to his condition, but every word was filled with genuine emotion. "God save our gracious Queen, long live our noble Queen, God save the Queen." The effect on the crowd was immediate and profound. Other voices began to join in, starting with the people closest to Tommy and spreading outward until the entire gathering was singing the national anthem together. But all eyes remained on the small boy who had started it, standing tall despite his challenges, honoring the guards who had honored him. The guards, who were supposed to continue marching until they were out of sight, found themselves deeply moved by this display. Sergeant Walsh made another unprecedented decision. He called his men to halt and had them turn to face the crowd once more. In a moment that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives, the guards stood at attention and allowed the crowd to finish singing the national anthem in Tommy's honor. They had completely abandoned protocol now, but they were following something more important: their hearts. When the singing ended, the guards performed one final formal salute to the entire crowd, but everyone knew it was really for Tommy. Then, with the same precision they had shown throughout the ceremony, they turned and marched away, leaving behind a crowd of people who had witnessed something truly extraordinary. As the guards disappeared from view, Tommy slowly sat back down in his wheelchair, exhausted but exhilarated. The crowd began to disperse, but not before many people approached Tommy and his mother to express their admiration for what they had witnessed. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," said an elderly gentleman with tears in his eyes. "That young man showed us all what real dignity looks like." A mother with her own young children stopped by to speak to Sarah. "Your son is remarkable," she said. "My children will never forget what they saw today. He taught them something important about respect and courage." But perhaps the most touching moment came when a veteran soldier, recognizing Tommy's salute and bearing, approached the wheelchair and spoke directly to the boy. "Son," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've served in 3 wars, and I've never seen anyone show more honor and dignity than you did today. Those guards were right to salute you. You're a true gentleman." Tommy listened to all the kind words with growing wonder. He had come to see the Queen's Guards hoping for nothing more than a glimpse of their famous uniforms. Instead, he had received the greatest honor of his young life and had shown others what it meant to rise to the occasion with grace and dignity. As they prepared to leave the castle grounds, Tommy turned back for one last look at the place where magic had happened. "Mummy," he said quietly, "do you think they'll remember me?" Sarah squeezed her son's hand gently. "Sweetheart," she replied, "I think they'll remember you for the rest of their lives. And more importantly, you'll always remember that you were brave enough to stand up and salute them back. You showed everyone what a real soldier looks like." 3 weeks after the ceremony at Windsor Castle, James Wellington received an unexpected summons to his commanding officer's office. His heart raced as he walked through the corridors of the barracks, knowing that word of their unprecedented Actions had finally reached the highest levels of command. Colonel Harrison, a stern man with 30 years of military service, was waiting behind his desk with several official-looking documents spread before him. James stood at attention, prepared to face whatever consequences awaited him and his fellow guards for breaking protocol. "Guard Wellington," the colonel began, his voice giving nothing away. "I understand you and your men took some liberties during the ceremony 3 weeks ago." "Yes, sir," James replied, knowing there was no point in denying what had happened. "We broke protocol to acknowledge a special needs child in the crowd. I take full responsibility for initiating the action." "Colonel." Harrison studied James for a long moment, then did something completely unexpected. He smiled. "Guard Wellington, in my 30 years of service, I have never been more proud of soldiers under my command." James blinked in confusion. "Sir?" The colonel turned his computer screen toward James, showing him a video that had been viewed millions of times across social media platforms. It showed the entire interaction with Tommy, from the first subtle acknowledgments to the final salute and the crowd singing the national anthem. "This video has been shared around the world," Colonel Harrison explained. "The royal family has received thousands of messages praising the actions of the Queen's Guard. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge specifically requested that their personal thanks be passed along to you and your men." James felt his knees go weak with relief and amazement. "Sir, we thought we would be facing disciplinary action." "On the contrary," the colonel continued, "you've reminded the world what the Queen's Guard truly represents. We don't just protect ceremony and tradition. We represent the values of compassion, honor, and respect for all people. What you did that day embodied those values perfectly." The colonel handed James an official letter with the royal seal. "This is a commendation from Her Majesty herself." She was particularly moved by the story and wanted to personally recognize the guards who showed such kindness to young Tommy Mitchell. But that wasn't the only surprise waiting for James. The colonel explained that the story had reached far beyond social media. News outlets around the world had picked up the story, and it had become a symbol of hope and human decency in an often divided world. "We've received letters from parents of special needs children from over 40 countries, the colonel said, showing James a stack of correspondence. "They're thanking you for showing their children that they matter, that they deserve respect and recognition just like anyone else." Meanwhile, back in their small town, Tommy's life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. The local newspaper had run a front-page story about his experience, making him something of a local celebrity. But more importantly, his classmates and community members began to see him differently. Children who had previously ignored him now sought him out on the playground, eager to hear his story about the Queen's Guards. Teachers used his experience as an example of courage and dignity. Tommy, who had often felt invisible or different, now felt valued and respected. The school principal, Mrs. Davidson, called Tommy and his mother into her office one afternoon. "Tommy," she said, "we've received a very special invitation for you." She handed him an official envelope with the royal coat of arms. Inside was an invitation for Tommy and his family to attend a private tea at Buckingham Palace, where he would have the opportunity to meet some of the senior members of the Royal Guard and receive personal recognition for his dignity and courage during the ceremony. Tommy's eyes grew wide as his mother read the invitation aloud. "Mummy, does this mean I get to go to the Queen's house?" "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "It means the Queen herself wants to meet the brave boy who showed everyone what real courage looks like." The tea at Buckingham Palace took place 6 weeks later. Tommy, dressed in his best suit and carrying a new Union Jack flag, walked through the palace doors with the same dignity he had shown at Windsor Castle. He was greeted by James Wellington and the other guards who had participated in that magical day. "Hello, Tommy," James said, stepping forward in his dress uniform. "Do you remember me?" Tommy's face lit up with recognition and joy. "You're the guard who looked at me. You're the one who saluted me first." "That's right," James replied, kneeling down to Tommy's eye level. "And I want you to know that saluting you was one of the greatest honors of my military career. During Aria, The tea. Tommy met with several members of the royal family, each of whom expressed their admiration for his behavior and the positive impact his story had on people around the world. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Sergeant Walsh presented Tommy with an honorary certificate recognizing him as an honorary member of Her Majesty's Guard. This certificate, Sergeant Walsh explained, is given to civilians who have shown exceptional courage, dignity, and honor in the presence of the Queen's Guard. You've earned this recognition through your own actions, Tommy. You showed us all what it means to be truly brave. As they prepared to leave the palace, Tommy turned to James Wellington with a question that had been on his mind since that day at Windsor Castle. "Mr. James, why did you break the rules for me?" James thought for a moment, then gave Tommy an answer that would stay with him forever. "Tommy, sometimes the most important rules aren't written down anywhere. They're the rules of the heart, like treating others with kindness, showing respect for people who are different, and recognizing courage when you see it. You showed us courage that day, and we couldn't let it go unrecognized." Months later, the story of Tommy and the Queen's Guards continued to inspire people around the world. The video remained popular on social media, not just as entertainment but as a reminder of the power of human compassion and the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. James Wellington and his fellow guards returned to their regular duties, but they were changed by the experience. They had learned that sometimes the most important thing a soldier can do is not follow orders, but follow their conscience. They had broken character that day, but in doing so, they had revealed the true character that lay beneath their ceremonial uniforms. Tommy kept his honorary certificate framed on his bedroom wall, next to photos from his day at Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace. Whenever he faced challenges because of his condition, he would look at those reminders and remember the day when the Queen's Guard showed him, and the world, that everyone deserves respect, recognition, and honor, regardless of their differences. The story became a testament to the power of simple human kindness and the impact that one moment of compassion can have on countless lives. Schools around the world began using Tommy's story in their lessons about inclusion and respect for differences. Military academies incorporated it into their training programs as an example of how true honor sometimes requires going beyond written rules to follow moral principles. Years later, when Tommy graduated from high school, he received congratulatory messages from James Wellington and the other guards who had made his childhood dream so memorable. James had been promoted to sergeant and was now training new recruits, always sharing Tommy's story as an example of why their service meant more than just ceremony and tradition. Tommy's mother, Sarah, often reflected on that transformative day at Windsor Castle. She had brought her son to see the Queen's Guards, hoping to give him a happy memory, but she never imagined that their brief encounter would touch so many lives around the world. The kindness shown by those guards had not only changed Tommy's life, but had reminded everyone who witnessed it that the most powerful force in the world is not military might, but human compassion. The Queen's Guards continued their ceremonial duties with the same precision and professionalism they had always shown, but Tommy's story had become part of their legacy. New guards were told about the day their predecessors chose compassion over protocol, and how that choice had honored both their service and their humanity. Tommy himself grew up to become an advocate for people with disabilities, often speaking about the importance of seeing beyond differences to recognize the dignity and worth in every person. He would always end his speeches by saying, "The Queen's Guards taught me that real strength comes from lifting others up, and real honor comes from treating everyone with respect." The Union Jack flag Tommy had waved that day was carefully preserved and displayed in his family home, a reminder of a moment when the world stood still to witness the beauty of human kindness, transcending all boundaries and expectations.